Okay, so now let's talk about the developmental process of language for children who are simultaneous bilingual, which means that they are learning two first languages at the same time, right? Before the age of 3, it's considered that they don't have a foundation in either language yet, and so they're actually learning two at the same time. So you'll notice that a lot of the things are similar. We start with the crying stage. There's also the cooing stage, as well as the babbling stage. But the one thing that is a little bit different in the babbling stage is in the sound system processing in children, they're going to be exposed simultaneously to two languages. Where, for example, the monolingual child would have been exposed to only one. So the difference is that initially the child treats the input from both languages, right, the sounds that they're hearing from both languages, as part of a single system. And then later, as they progress, then they start to distinguish which sound belongs to which system, or which sounds are shared, but are used in both the language A and language B. But at the early stages, the bilingual child's task is quite complicated by the fact that they have to do the work of distinguishing the languages and the sounds from each other. So it's absolutely normal that there's an initial period where the child will interchange phonemes between the languages or use blends of sounds to express the same concepts across languages. Let me give you an example of that. So, in the word, the word scratch in English is kratzen in German. And so a simultaneous bilingual child, before the age of 3, hearing both of those terms being used by an adult, for example, they might sort of assimilate the phonemes that they're hearing and come up with their own unique term, which is not part of either language, okay, das, and use it to mean scratch in English and to mean kratzen in German. Same thing as the second example, nuet. So new in English is ued in Estonian, and together the child might form their own sort of unique term, nuet, and use that in both English and Estonian. Remember that this happens sort of in the very early stages. Once they are continually exposed to the two languages, the child will start to differentiate the actual term in English versus Estonian. They will stop using that sort of made-up term and develop from there. Then we get to the formulaic language use. Just like for monolinguals, simultaneous bilingual children start to learn meanings and the labels for them. And there's a period between the ages of 1 and 2.5 where children will overextend the meaning of the words that they're using. So like I had explained to you before, with dog, meaning both a dog and just an animal in general and perhaps small or a physical object. But this looks a little bit different for simultaneous bilingual children who have two languages going on. So they might take they might use one word which sounds like it could come from one language and use it for all the objects, like sh in this example, coming from the German language to mean auto and choo-choo. As well as train, airplane, and wheelbarrow. And then the expanded syntax and vocabulary is very similar. Again, remember that whether it's a highly inflected language or a low inflected language, the child is going to differ in what is developing first. If the child is in a situation where they are developing or where language A is a highly inflected language, language B is a low inflected language, what's going to happen is that there's probably going to be a mix towards the attention that the child gives to word order and to morphology. And this is why studies show all the time that children who are bilingual have much more metalinguistic awareness about the language. They have much more implicit knowledge about how language works and the function and grammaticality of language, because they're always sort of participating in that or engaged in the process of figuring out how the two languages work, right? How the systems work. And so it makes sense why a child that is bilingual is going to have more insight into the way that language is structured and how we use language than a monolingual child who does not have to go through that process. And that's also another reason why it's so beneficial to have children engage or to have children learn 2 or 3 languages from a very early age. Okay, so let's talk about then the language development process of a child or a student who learns an additional language after the age of 3. Again, we consider these sequential bilinguals as separate or different to simultaneous bilinguals because researchers believe that around the age of 3, children have developed a substantial foundation in that first language that they've learned, right? Also, remember that a simultaneous bilingual can also be a sequential bilingual if they add a third language after the age of 3. Okay, so the simultaneous bilingual child will be listening and learning 2 languages before the age of 3. If they add on a third language or a fourth language after that age, then in those languages they're considered to be sequential bilinguals. So here is the stages of development. First, we get home language use. And often children begin the second language learning process by using their first language to communicate as they begin to learn new words in that second language. So for example, preschool contexts where no one in the classroom speaks the child's home language, and the home language is not used for instruction, the child is going to begin by using the language that they know to try and communicate. But the child is going to gather rather quickly that this is not effective, that their meaning is not being communicated, and they'll make this realization that that language that they're using is not appropriate for that context. So what will happen is they'll enter into a nonverbal or listening period. I like to call this an active listening period because even though it may look like the child is passive or not responsive or not receptive, actually what's going on in the mind of the child is that the child is 100% engaged in everything that is happening around them. They're paying attention and listening to every sort of interaction and language use that's being used, either including themselves or if they're witnessing language interaction. And what's going on in this point is that children are trying to make sense of what they're hearing. They're trying to connect times when they hear the same language, the same words, the same vocabulary, and start to develop ideas about what the vocabulary means, and also how to communicate the activities that they would usually be involved in, such as going to the bathroom, and how to ask to go to the bathroom, or saying that they're hungry, or asking for something. Those are the points in which the child is going to be listening and trying to establish sort of a primary base in that language. Okay, it's very important that you keep in mind that this is a normal process that children go into a period where they're silent. It does not mean that they're passive or not receptive or not listening at all. Some people, some teachers make the mistake of thinking those things, and it can end up pretty badly if they start the process of, for example, referring the child to special education or for services of some kind, especially when they haven't given the child really enough time in that period. Also, another thing to note is that younger children tend to stay longer in this period than older children because they have a lot more to sort of gather. Older children have had more exposure to language in general, and so they also have the more well-developed memory skills and information processing skills. So they usually go through this active listening period faster than younger children. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that social interaction during this period is also very crucial. Even though the child may not be actively participating, having the child be in situations where they're hearing different language used for different purposes is going to help them in their sort of research and processing of the language that they're hearing. Okay, then the next stage is formulaic language use, and just like we had seen with the other developmental stages, we're going to start with one word and two word utterances. So I'm going to give you an example of that. So they might start with something like mommy car, or more milk, or bowl blue. Basically very short words or two words together to try and express themselves. This doesn't mean necessarily that the children are going to understand what they're saying, right? Or in terms of the components, such as mommy is a noun and car is a noun, or give bowl, give is a verb and bowl is a noun. They're not going to understand that piece, but they are going to understand that saying that statement gets them something. Then as they start to develop and their syntactical awareness, their morphological awareness, they're going to become more apt to switch things up in the sentence. So you can see that I like X might be a formulaic language sort of sentence statement. And as they develop, then they start to switch up that noun that would go in that I like slot. Okay? So it becomes I like milk, I like Maria, I like mama. And so slowly they're gaining ownership over the language and understanding what types of words go in which slots. And then you start to see much more productive language use, where they are owning the language more and being able to shift around the words in the orders to communicate different meanings. Okay. So at this point, I want to introduce you to the next activity, which is the interdependence between the L1 and L2. What I'd like you to do is to think about which of the following first language concepts would transfer to the student's second language. And remember that we've gone over this diagram before. This is Cummins' underlying proficiency. With the iceberg, remember that anything below the line, the water, means that that's that central processing system, right? All the languages are joined there. They're not separate in the mind. In the mind, they exist in one information processing system. Above the water represents when we use the language. So right now, it sounds like I'm using English. And I'm using English, but it doesn't mean that the information, the thinking that I'm going through is not connected to all of my other understandings about language in general. Okay? From Italian to French to Spanish to Arabic and all of those things. So that's what the theory states. So what I would like you to do, you can find this activity sheet in the same unit that you're watching this video. Think through which of the following concepts would go below the water, meaning that it's something that can be transferred across language. It's a skill that can be transferred. And then which ones would go above the water, meaning that it is specific to one language and would have to be relearned in the other language. Excuse me. In the activity sheet, you will see that these concepts are listed A through I. And so you can just write the letter for ease, either above the water or below. You can also pause the video at this point to give you some time to do that. And up next, I will go through it with you. Okay, so let's go through it together. The first thing I'm going to do is go through all of the concepts which would transfer across languages. Okay, so all of the concepts that would not have to be relearned to be used in that second language. Understanding that objects have labels, right? Just that concept that everything that you see around you, and even abstract notions, terms, has a label, right? Words with similar roots and meanings. So the fact that there are some crossovers between vocabulary in Spanish and English, general and general being one of them. That's something that is going to transfer because they mean the same thing and they have the same root. And there's actually a very, very long list of words like that between Spanish and English, which is really helpful for your Spanish-speaking ELLs. The sense and the reference of words, understanding about meaning in general, understanding that sound clusters are made up of individual sounds. So, for example, that when we're hearing multiple sounds, we understand that we can actually break them up into individual sounds. This is something that you've learned through English, if English is your first language. And if you, for example, if you were to learn Spanish, that's an idea that would help you in Spanish too, because it's the same way that Spanish works. And similarly in any alphabetic language. Okay? If you have an English language learner that is coming to you with a first language that is not alphabetic, such as Cantonese, for example, or Mandarin is another one, then that understanding about sound clusters and how they are tied to symbols is not going to be there, because that's not something that represents the way that their first language works. Okay, we're going to get into that a little bit more later. But again, remember that when you have your Spanish-speaking ELLs in your classroom, many of them will be Spanish-speaking ELLs. You will have others as well. But I just want to really reinforce that these students, when they come with Spanish skills and have developed Spanish as their first language, there are many, many, many skills that they're coming with that you don't have to reteach them. In fact, you as a teacher want to make those skills that they already know as explicit as possible and tell them, these are the ideas that you've already learned. Now I want you to use them in English, apply them to English. Okay, sounds from the first language found in the second language, right? Understanding that endings of words indicate how they're used in sentences. So that is that morphology understanding. For example, the ly at the end of adjectives makes the adjective into an adverb. We know that adverbs describe verbs. That same suffix, ly, the translation of that is mente, which is again also same thing, added to adjectives to describe verbs. So all you would have to do is teach the Spanish-speaking English language learner that mente is ly, li. And that student is already going to know what word it's supposed to go on to, because it's the same thing in Spanish, where in the sentence it's supposed to go. It's supposed to go before verbs, like in Spanish. And so all of those skills are transferable. Okay, let's talk about the skills that are not transferable, the skills that would have to be relearned in the second language. General vocabulary terms, outside of those ones that have the similar roots like general and general. Sounds from the first language that are not found in the second language. So in English, that those phonemes th and the, as I had told you before, I think English is one of the few languages that contain those sounds. So those two sounds are something that the English language learner is going to have to learn to pronounce. But there are many sounds that they come knowing already that we use, such as s, right? A lot of them. Okay, and then particular morpheme endings, as I had described to you before, that ly to match to mente is what you would have to teach them as a teacher. Where it goes on a word, what it means about the word, those are skills that they're bringing with them. So hopefully that helps you to understand your role as a teacher and how you really have to pay attention to the language of English and the language skills that these students bring, these English language learners bring with them in their first language.